This is Section 8, Lecture 4. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about our national security policy regarding international terrorism. Terrorism and international terrorism is not a new threat, but it's a great threat from larger terrorist organizations and global actors such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS are relatively new. Typically, what has been considered a terrorist threat was always in a regional focus. But over a long history of terrorism and over sort of a long history of academia, we've come up with these sort of general definitions or ideas of what terrorism is and what composes a terrorist group. One definition is the use of violence against non-combatant targets. That is, the use of violence against civilians and civilian targets in order to achieve political change. Some people have a problem with that definition because an act of violence against even state targets like embassies or military installations or military personnel could be acts of terrorism as well. But in all definitions, this use of violence to achieve political change is always present. Another definition is that terrorism is a form of psychological warfare that is set or based on the emotional response that's going to be elicited from the act of violence. Another definition is based on the motivation of terrorists. Is the action designed to create fear? Is it there then to create political pressure? And so the use of violence by non-state actors for political change, despite the target, typically is in all definitions of terrorism. And so then, if we talk about terrorism, we have to oftentimes weed out the ideology and talk about the method. The method is violence and the act of violence. That it's politically motivated and it's done by private actors, not a nation state. And so it can be directed at a government or at civilians. And generalizations about the sort of recent definitions is that there's premeditation, that these are thought out long in advance. They're not just reactionary riots that would fall under terrorism, but acts of violence that are thought out well in advance. Acts of violence that have a political motivation. Others will include economic and religious motivations, but because we are political scientists, or at least from the political science perspective, we can say then that the desire to control a nation-state's economy, the desire to control the nation-state's society, if we're talking about religious motivations, are also very political in their nature. The target, right, is one of those things that's controversial. Is it does it have to be a civilian population that is non-combatants, or can it be directed towards government targets? And of course, one of the other key factors is the clandestine nature of these. In a theoretical aspect, we can talk about the responses to international terrorism, and then perhaps how they may influence our own U.S. foreign policy. How do you react to terrorism? do you give in? Well, from a theoretical perspective, and we also see from a practical perspective, the answer is no, because it's seen that it will encourage others to engage in these same activities, thinking that they can get an accommodation or result from your government. And so oftentimes our politicians use the term, we will not negotiate with terrorists, and this is in response to that theoretical point. Another response could be a counterattack, to either preemptively strike terrorist targets or go after groups once they have struck your country. Well, of course, this is the basis of our current national security policy regarding terrorism. One of the criticisms of this is to ask the question, will this cause more terrorism? Are you creating a vicious cycle? That's not something that oftentimes gets a whole lot of play in the discussions, because it is seen as a part of our national security posture that we must demonstrate resolve. We must stand up for ourselves in the face of these threats. Another element of tackling terrorism is to impose the rule of law. And this is something that we see in our national security policy, particularly when it comes to being involved with other nation states and even private actors such as multinational banks. Enforcing international laws and building international laws that will limit the ability of terrorist organizations to strike, their ability to ship weapons, their ability to transfer money, their ability to travel. All of these things are elements of combating terrorism that are focused on imposing the rule of law. And of course, we see another element of our national security policy, increasing intelligence and monitoring. This is something that we see currently, and of course is being debated as well, but finding out more about these groups in order to prevent future attacks and to get rid of the threat is also an element of our national security policy. As I mentioned earlier, terrorism is not new, right? You have seen different waves of terrorism throughout recent history, let's say the last century or so. And the motivation, the ideology, why it has to be oftentimes taken out of a definition is because in these historical waves of terrorism, there has been left-wing terrorism, right-wing terrorism, ethnic or national separatist terrorism, and then, of course, religious fundamentalism. And if we look at left-wing terrorism, its history is seen in any number of instances. There was an anarchist wave in Eastern Europe and even here in the United States during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The assassination of President McKinley, the attempted assassination of President Theodore Roosevelt would have been seen as the part of that anarchist wave of terrorism. The most famous instance of this was shooting Archbishop Ferdinand, that instance that was seen to spark World War I. There were any number of separatist movements and independence movements in the 20th century, and this is under that anti-colonial wave of terrorism, where different groups were formed and fought against what they saw as colonial oppressors at the time. But their tactics, right? They're private actors using violence in order to change the political situation. There was a leftist wave of terrorism in the 60s and 70s and 80s, particularly in Europe, that oftentimes had to do with Marxism And so in Germany, you had the Red Army faction, the Red Brigade in Italy. There are other separatist movements, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, focused against Israel, the Irish Republican Army, focused against British control of Northern Ireland, ETA, which is the Basque separatist movement in Spain. And so we see all of those as being influential, but there's different motivations. What, of course, we're focused on in a current context is religious fundamentalism and that motivation for terrorism today. So, how do we combat terrorism? What are our national security policies? Well, we have some generalizations about these. Diplomacy is one element of combating terrorism. And this is sharing information with other countries, building international laws, working with financial organizations in order to criminalize the movement of money, the movement of people, so on and so forth. And so our diplomatic efforts are where we see the State Department working with other nation states to try to freeze the money of terrorist organizations, to try to share information and intelligence about these organizations and these people. We see efforts at public diplomacy as well, trying to influence the public in other countries. One of the State Department's current programs is to try to combat on social media the influence of ISIS posted videos. Well, when the State Department sort of posts these sort of contrary videos, that would be an element of public diplomacy. Most infamously, of course, is the use of military power in order to combat terrorism. This is the use of military forces. It is the use of drone strikes. It is the use of missile strikes, and of course, individual assassinations. And this runs into problems, and there are any number of constraints. There are legal constraints, because a lot of this would violate not just international law, but our own domestic laws as well. And this is something that the Obama administration has had sort of legal constraints or legal problems about, and that is the targeted assassination of U.S. citizens who are seen to be supportive of and members of terrorist organizations. Yet, they went ahead with those targeted assassinations. But this creates other constraints. The political consequences, for example, here at home or abroad. Oftentimes this puts our allies at a disagreement with us. And then there are the operational constraints against fighting terrorism. Terrorist organizations are usually small, a mobile force. They're hidden within civilian populations. And so striking them militarily is oftentimes very difficult. Other military constraints are tied with the political constraints. Does the public support so-called boots on the ground in fighting against terrorists? Well, then that would, if the answer is no, then that would place a operational constraint on what we could do. Other military strategies, right, would be to oppose terrorist supporting nation states. And this was a policy that we saw under the Bush administration. In one of his State of the Union addresses, President Bush basically made the statement, you're either with us or against us. And he came out against North Korea. He came out against Iraq and Iran as being terrorist supporting states. Well, Iraq wasn't necessarily, in hindsight, a terrorist supporting state in that so-called axis of evil. Using force against those states who may support terrorist governments, cooperating with friendly states against terrorist organizations, that is an act of diplomacy, opposing states only tangentially related to terror groups, but engaged in other activities. Well, maybe that's where Iraq would fall in our perceptions, at least, of Iraq and their weapons programs. Other elements of combating terrorism: domestic security. And we see as an element of our national security policy the passing of the Patriot Act, the development of the new bureaucracy, Homeland Security, in order to provide this greater domestic defense against these acts of violence. And so then, this is to mitigate or minimize any potential threat of terrorism. We have attempted to have more secure borders, more secure airplane travel, for example, increasing our own information gathering here domestically as well. The infamous NSA spying program was part of that. And so then we see those efforts in our national security policy all on the basis of combating terrorism. Economically, we combat terrorism by trying to freeze the money of terrorist organizations. We have attempted to coerce state supporters of terrorism through international sanctions. And this is one of those things that has a mixed response, because oftentimes, and we'll discuss this in our chapter on economic statecraft, sanctions don't necessarily work to their their targeted effect. They're very slow. It's uncertain to whether or not a country will give in to your demands. And so then using sanctions doesn't necessarily work. But economically, you can do other things, such as freezing bank accounts of people suspected of terrorist ties. And that has seemed to work more greatly, particularly in combating Al-Qaeda in the 2000s. And then, of course, as part of our military action is covert action. And this is using paramilitary forces, perhaps the CIA, using all other kinds of technological, social media, so on and so forth, where you see media and public diplomacy. You've seen elements of trying to bribe leaders. That was part of the surge strategy in fighting in Iraq, what was then known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and some of them were the main opposition groups. And so the surge, the military surge in Iraq during 2006, 2007 was an attempt to sort of quell this violence there, and part of that was based on paying off some of the leaders of these groups. And so then there's any numbers of ways to combat terrorism, and any numbers of ways that our national security policies have been geared to do so. But we do find our limitations. There are political limitations, questioning, where we want to be engaged, how much we want to pay for it, to what extent do we want our military personnel in harm's way. There are debates and deliberations of whether or not this should be a military strategy or should it be a law enforcement policy. I have that there at the bottom. Is this a war or is this a law enforcement effort? Well, if we use our military strategies in order to combat terrorism directly, that's one thing. But if we're using diplomacy, If we're using international law for freezing bank accounts, all these sort of things, that's more of a law enforcement exercise. Another major theoretical complaint or criticism or problem with combating terrorism is, when does this end? How do terrorist groups end? Well, you can't necessarily kill ideas. And so then there has to be longer term social and economic strategies in these countries where terrorists are fostered in order for the ideology of those groups to be less attractive to new recruits. And still another debate or deliberation is, how is success measured? Is it measured in a terrorist body count? Is it measured in a limited number of violent attacks by terrorists? These are things that are debated and deliberated as part of our national security policies regularly.